my name is Neil Salisbury. I teach history at Smith College, courses primarily in early American history and Native American history. And these have really been the sort of focus of my research and scholarly interests since going into academia about 30 years ago.
And you've been at Smith for that time?
Yes, almost all that time, yeah.
Tell me about your primary interest in academia.
Well, my research has focused primarily on relations between indigenous peoples and English colonizers in New England in the 17th century. So although I've had a lot of other side projects along the way, that has been the core of my work, and I've published a book and many articles on that subject, given many talks on it.
Who were the Native Americans who were living here when the first Europeans came?
Well, right here in Northampton, the Norwottuck people were living here, and they spoke an Algonquian language. Algonquian languages were the most widely spoken in North America. They were closely related to the Agawam people in Springfield, the Woronokos at Westfield, the Pocumtucks at Deerfield, and all these people were pretty closely related. They had their ancestors had really lived here, come to the valley thousands of years earlier, possibly as many as 8,000 or 9,000 years earlier. And they developed ways of life, of living in the region here. And probably around 1000 AD or so, they adopted corn, beans, and squash agriculture, added to a kind of hunting, gathering, fishing way of life that was already well developed. And the floodplains of the valley enabled them to really produce remarkable amounts of produce every year, amounts that astonished the English when they first arrived. And so this way of life was pretty well developed, pretty well established by the time the English first came.
Can you speak for a moment or two? And I know I'm asking questions that you could go on and speak about for hours and hours, but could you just speak a bit to the relationship that existed between the Native Americans and the early English settlers?
Okay, well, the first Europeans, actually, that the Norwottucks encountered were actually Dutch rather than English. And even before encountering the Dutch, they probably were picking up Dutch trade goods via trade with their neighbors to the west and to the south. And there's evidence, too, that they were picking up an occasional French item from Canada. In other words, natives themselves, of course, had very elaborate trade relationships that crisscrossed the whole region. And so they were picking up items like this, not in large quantities. The Dutch established themselves on the Hudson River after Henry Hudson arrives there in 1609. And they are trading all over what is then the very southern part of New England, from Cape Cod down to the mouth of the Hudson, as well as up the Hudson River, from the early 16 teens onward. And then in 1614, the first recorded encounter between the Norwottuck and a European is with a Dutch explorer named Adrian Block, who sails up the Connecticut River as far as Enfield Falls. But among the people he says he meets there were a people that at least his recorder called the Nawas, and these would seem to be a kind of shorthand for Norwottuck, given the names that he records there. So, so from that point on, the Dutch are traveling up the river every year in the 16 teens. And that's a very active trade. What the Norwottucks and other people are going down and bringing to the traders who come up to Enfield, usually beaver pelts. And they're getting axes, iron axes, knives, some cloth, glass beads, other items that are become quickly very popular with Native Americans are among the things that they're receiving in return. So the earliest relationships actually are with the Dutch. The English don't get terribly interested in the Connecticut River Valley until the 1630s. And then you have some English people getting interested in trading, and the Dutch get alarmed, and the end result of it is that they both kind of establish trading posts, year-round trading posts on the Connecticut River. kind of between Hartford and Enfield. And this is followed very quickly by an epidemic of smallpox. And smallpox among Native Americans in the 1630s is a much more deadly affair than it is among Europeans, because Native Americans have no previous exposure to this disease. And so it has just catastrophic effects. And in fact, one of the Dutch traders reports that of the approximately 1,000 Native Americans around Enfield there, that 950 had died. So I mean, we're talking about a Holocaust of just really major proportions. The decline in population seems to be one of the factors that attracts the English to the area. They had been a little bit concerned about, previously to this, about the large population. Now suddenly you have an agriculturally very productive region. It doesn't have as many people, and so you get a heightened English interest. And a man named William Pynchon sails up the Connecticut River in 1635. He actually comes up as far as what is soon to be Springfield. He's trading with Indians in that region, probably including the Norwottics, because we know that they were very close to the Agawam Indians at Springfield at the time. And the very next year he comes back and he actually negotiates for a piece of land on the east side of the river that is, and in 1636 establishes the town of Springfield, has some settlers with him, and also begins a much more active trading relationship with the natives. So at first he's buying lots of, I talked earlier about the enormous corn productivity, agricultural productivity here, and he's buying large quantities of corn and then turning around and selling that to the English settlers who moved in. He also turns around and sells them land. He is also selling corn to settlers in Connecticut, and he's a very entrepreneurially minded man, and he's doing very well. And so, and eventually he transforms, moves from trading for corn as the settlers begin producing their own, and moves back toward furs, and has a very high volume fur trade going with the natives in this region. And he talks a great deal about the Norwottics very specifically, talks about individual people, talks about some of his relationships with some of these people, and he begins to buy more land on the Connecticut River, and he's trading. You can actually find some of his account books. Some of them have been published, or at least, and others have been transcribed. And you can see that what he's providing them above all is cloth, and then various sewing implements. Yards and yards of linen and kersey and wool, along with scissors and needles and pins and thimbles. Native people are consuming these in just humongous quantities, really. And they're in return, they're bringing him primarily beaver pelts, occasionally fox, otter, marten skins, but primarily beaver pelts. And there's a very enterprising and very lucrative trade going on here.
And the Northampton piece of this?
Well, the Norwottics are part of this operation. They, along with the Agawams and others. Now, what's going to happen eventually is that there's going to be a shift. That is, the natives have always, of course, hunted animals for skins for their own use, perhaps for meat and so on and so forth. But what happens when they're hunting these animals for profit, for exchange, for trade, is that they begin to deplete the population. And what happens is that the region's beaver population really becomes virtually extinct. And I know a lot of people around the area who are quite aware, to their detriment maybe, that the beaver population is no longer extinct, but for a time it was because of this overhunting. So that becomes a problem for the natives in the area. And what Pynchon does is he's always had this system where when he deals with these native hunters, he advances them credit. In other words, he gives them the goods I was talking about in advance before they go out to hunt for the year. So what happens beginning in the late 1650s, when they start coming back empty-handed, or at least with not as many skins as they'd contracted for, is that they're in debt to him. And what happens when those debts accumulate for a year or two is he begins taking land from them, basically as collateral. And what's happening at the same time is that the native population, although smallpox has reduced the population initially, natives continue to be especially vulnerable to various diseases that the English bring.
And about what is the year that we're looking at,
Now,
or the decade?
we're looking at the late 1650s and then into the 1660s. So we're looking at an English population that is growing and that wants more land. So what Pynchon is doing then is basically getting this land from the native people, and he's turning around and he's selling it to the English. Native people are finding themselves without land. They're finding their communities depleted. They're basically living in poverty. There's a lot of evidence around Springfield, the kinds of scenes of sort of Indian poverty that we even think of often in our own time, already beginning at that time.
And Northampton was part of this whole development.
Northampton was very much part of this development. Now, there's another development that exacerbates the situation even worse, and that is that the Norwatic people have traditionally, or at least for many decades, and perhaps before the English arrived even, been friends with the Mohawk Iroquois over in what is now New York State, upstate New York. That relationship, for reasons we don't have time to go into here, deteriorates. And so they're getting attacked by the Mohawks at the same time as they're suffering at the hands of the English. And it's these Mohawk attacks that drive the Norwatics to actually ask the local officials in Northampton in the year 1664 to, please build a little fort for us that we can take shelter in from these attacks. So that's where we get Fort Hill in 1664, which is, of course, 10 years after the founding of Northampton. But in spite of this, the relationship with the English continues to deteriorate, and the English, for various diplomatic reasons, are on the side of the Mohawk Iroquois and wars with the French and so on. But you're having parallel sort of tensions and resentments among Indians growing throughout the region. And so this explodes in the year 1665 in what's called King Phillips War, which is a war that lasts a little over a year in New England, and in which in the valley here, it's the Indians that they thought were loyal begin basically attacking the towns, and in some cases, the case of Springfield and some other towns, are burned completely to the ground. Northampton's attacked on a couple of occasions, although it manages to hold on and not be abandoned or anything. But the war is a very bloody affair, and in the end, the Norwatics are, along with the other Indians, are all defeated. And so of course, lots of Indians died in this war. The land was basically lost completely, and the people who survived, the Norwatics who survived, basically left the area and joined with Indians to the north, to the west, to the east. And so the Norwatic people as a community in this area really doesn't appear again after King Philip's War, although many people come back as individuals in the years that follow.
Thank you so much. It's been fascinating to sit and listen to your very pithy summation of years of history. And I wish that we had more time. Our time is up so soon. I want to thank you very much. Perhaps there'll be another opportunity to continue.
Well, thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
Let's start with you just stating your name and tell me in a sentence or two a little bit about you, what you're doing these days.
Sure. My name is Brian Turner. I'm co-author with John S. Bowman, an editor and freelance writer and lives in Northampton, of a book called The Hurrah Game, Baseball in Northampton, 1823 through 1953. I work at Smith College. I'm what's called a writing counselor. That's really a teacher of composition.
Thank you. So I'd like to begin with asking you a little bit about who were some of the local players in baseball in Northampton?
Well, my favorite was Jim Ryan, who was my neighbor on Corticelli Street here in Florence. In fact, I wound up buying my house from Jim when he was 90. And then he moved next door with his sister, which was the house he had grown up in, and he lived to be 101. And we would talk about baseball all the time. And at one point, he started telling me about the old days in baseball even before he played. He had played with the Florence Braves in the 1920s, which was a famous semi-professional team right here in Florence. And he started telling me about the minor league teams, and I'd never heard about them. I never even knew Northampton had a minor league team. So in order to keep that conversation going with him, I started going to the microfilm machines at the Forbes and looking up the old stories and bringing him the box scores and consulting with him, mainly just for him. And pretty soon I found out so many wonderful stories and facts that I decided that this would be something well worth sharing with the town and in general.
Now, this Mr. Ryan, had he been part of that larger Ryan family that's in town now?
Well, he's not connected to the Judge's family, though they kid each other and say, Judge Michael Ryan? No. They kid each other and they called each other cousin all the time. But he's a separate Ryan from that. But he had a pretty big clan of his own. Several of his brothers were also baseball players. One of them, Matty, was the star pitcher of the Florence Braves. The Florence Braves were active in the 20s, and they disbanded the first time in 1929. The Depression hit them pretty hard.
Any other local players come to mind?
Well, in the 1930s, a team that sort of took the Braves' place was the Arcanums. The Arcanums featured many fine players, and one is with us still today and has also been very helpful, and that's Russ Christensen, who is still in charge of the Florence Casket Factory. He's well into his 80s, still very sharp. I guess they grow people with a lot of longevity and long memories around here.
I'm hearing some familiar names, the Arcanums, and I know Mansfield has a role in this. Tell me a little bit about our local ball fields.
Well, I'll start with Arcanum Field because that's interesting. The Arcanums never really were paid. Before them, teams would get at least a little something. The Arcanums donated all their money toward eventually buying and giving to the city in the 50s a ball field called Arcanum Field. Mansfield is another story. That's named after Julius Main, a local merchant of some renown who was renowned for every year having the marble throw. He'd have a marble rally or scramble. He'd come out and throw pennies and marbles to the kids. Hundreds of kids would show up. He, upon his passing, he donated a parcel of land down by the Mill River, what I think is Riverside Drive, for a field, picnicking, sports, and that's Mansfield. But Mansfield's history goes all the way back as a sporting place to the 1840s. The Utopian community that was located down near the river called the Northampton Association for Education and Industry, or maybe Industry and Education, I'm not sure. A Utopian Transcendentalist community where Sojourner Truth lived. There are accounts from 1844 of a bat and ball game, as they called it, taking place in Paradise, which was clearly down where Mansfield is today. It was a picnicking ground well into the 1850s and 60s, and also a place for all kinds of sports.
Anything come to mind about the other fields in town?
Well, the driving park, of course, was the field where the race course is, down at the fairgrounds. And where that grandstand is, actually from the days in which Northampton had a minor league team, first in the Connecticut League and then in the Twin State League, that grandstand is actually the grandstand that people would sit in to see those games. It's been amended a little bit. The ball field was right in the racing oval, and it was an enclosed park, not just for the racing, but also for the ball games, and admission would be charged. There were also bleachers. And Jim Ryan, my neighbor, recalled going down there when he was 10 and waiting for the ball players to come out of the Bay State Hotel. They would dress there. There weren't any locker rooms. Walk up to the fairgrounds and go in and see the game. And he would wait and ask to carry their glove or their cleats, and that way he got into the game free.
Wonderful story.
Yeah.
How about, you've mentioned bats and so forth. Tell me a little bit about equipment, any changes there along the way?
Oh, well, you bet. The main change, I think, is the ball's gotten a lot harder from when it first, in the 1840s, when the game that we now call baseball was really had its origins in New York. The ball was slightly softer, and that's good because people played without gloves. They played without gloves until the 1880s. Perhaps the catchers in professional baseball began to have gloves before the other players. And they were unlike the gloves we see today, these big baskets. They were very skimpy, and they were so small, players had actually leave them on the field when they came in to bat. The bats stayed fairly similar. They're made maybe out of different materials. The knobs would change shape. Some bats would have two knobs, but bats remained largely the same. The ball got harder, and it's a good thing that one rule change took place, and that's a rule change involving something called soaking. There's a version of baseball called the Massachusetts game. It was later superseded by the New York game. New York, as always, seems to beat Massachusetts at baseball. And soaking in the Massachusetts game meant that you could get the runner out by hitting him with the baseball while he was running. So that ball, it's a good thing it had a little bit of give to it, not just because of the gloves, but also because of soaking. And then they dropped that when the Massachusetts game was taken over by the New York game. There were other major rule changes as well. There were some major differences as well as similarities.
How did these local teams, as we know them, get started? I mean, who decided that they were going to come together and play this game in the first place?
Well, the tradition of the club was really started in New York, the gentleman's club at the very beginning. Often they were professional men or men who saw themselves as having a certain amount of status, not necessarily the highest. And they would declare they were going to form a club for the purpose of baseball. Now, de Tocqueville said about Americans, that any time you get more than 3 or 4 of them together, the first thing they do is draw bylaws and elect officers and have a club for almost any reason. So this is very much an American tradition. But as baseball became more of a competitive and less of just a recreational activity, it started to make money. There was gambling on the games. Teams started charging admission. They would pay players by giving them jobs that were paid twice, maybe 3 times what other people would be paid for the same jobs. And then it wasn't a matter of someone just deciding. People thought there was money to be made, and that started driving the whole process from amateurism through the 1860s to the beginning of professionalism in the 1870s. Eventually, Northampton would form in the 1890s, playing down at the driving park, their own independent teams, in the hope not only to bring glory to Northampton and promote Northampton, but also in the hope of making some money. They didn't often succeed, if truth be told. What money was made was usually spent. Jim Ryan actually told me this, though this was before his time, that in order to offset losses that the independent teams, the teams with no set schedule, no league to belong to, they just made it up as they went along. In order to offset losses, at the end of the season, the Northampton team would bring in the National League teams, which was the major league at the time. So this would be the equivalent of, let's say, Teddy Bear Pools from the Tri-County League bringing in the Red Sox for a game. And of course, everyone in Northampton and Florence and the surrounding towns would show up, pay extra money to see this display by the true professionals, the world champions. And thousands would watch these games at the driving park. And it was very exciting for them to see the stars and to see our local boys play against them.
So the sport began as a gentleman's game, more or less, and then competition raised its head.
And profit. The National League started in 1876, and this is the same National League we know today. And that's when it was an all-out professional enterprise. But between 1871 and 1876, there was a sort of strange league called the National Association. But that was very loosely organized, and if a team didn't feel like finishing the season, it simply stopped playing. The nice thing about that was that for $10, any town could join this professional league.
Was there much of an intense rivalry between teams here in the Northampton?
Yes, the Bay State Athletics in the 1820s, in the 1920s, and the Florence Braves, that was always a signal to Northamptonites that the season was coming to an end, is when the Braves and the Athletics would face off either down behind the high school or up at Arcanum Field for the championship of the town. But that kind of competition went all the way back to the champion Florence Eagles of 1865 through 67, who would sometimes have games against Springfield or other surrounding towns, and to which 5,000 people would come and see the games. There was one down by where the VA is, down below the VA, at the corner there of Route 9 as it turns toward Williamsburg. And these were incredible matches, very competitive, and a source of great excitement of the local folks. So the competitive element won out over the gentlemanliness. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the perhaps most unique thing, and maybe a most important thing that we found out about local baseball. And that was the fact that the Florence Eagles of 1865 through 67, for the first two seasons, the first full season and part of the second season, were an integrated team. Now, this may be, well, it is, in fact, so far, the earliest known instance of an integrated amateur team in the history of baseball. And there was only one way I found out about this, and that was through Jim Ryan, who one day just told me that he knew a member of the Eagles, which in and of itself was astonishing, because here it was, the year 2000, I'm speaking to a man who knew someone who played baseball in the 1860s. And then he added, this man was a black man. And when I went to look into it, I couldn't find any confirmation of it. I found the man. His name was Luther B. Askin. I found confirmation that he himself was indeed regarded as black here in Florence. His mother clearly was black. His father we don't have any images of, but town records in Pittsfield say he was black. And yet there was no mention of this fact. Even as late as 1915, 1916, when the aged Florence Eagles gathered for the reunions with Judge J.B. O'Donnell and Arthur Hill, both former mayors, Askin was there, and yet no one made mention of the fact that he had integrated this team. And it's a great secret and mystery, though we think Askin may have been very deferential, which was a survival skill learned by African Americans and to get along in white society. And we think also, since his son and namesake, Luther Askin of Upper State New York, a band leader, had been passing for white for 20 years, that Luther may have decided it was best to keep this matter quiet for the sake of his son. So that was a fascinating story to learn about. And if it wasn't for Jim Ryan, it wouldn't have been known. And even the Eagles, I'd say 2 cheers to the Eagles. It was clearly an integrated team when they were in town, because everybody in town knew the Askin family. But when they went abroad to play outside the town, since Askin was very light-skinned himself, I think they didn't make any big deal about it. I don't think they said, hey, get a load of our African-American first baseman. I think they just said, we'll not mention this. And that may have been a habit that the whole team learned.
Fascinating stories. We're coming to the end of our time together, and I'm wondering if there's just anything you had wanted to add quickly, or anything you thought I would ask you that I didn't.
Well, the one thing I guess I would say is that if you look at anything, no matter how small or how local, closely enough, if you go into the records, very quickly, this is what I discovered without expecting to discover it, you will find some of the major issues of American society being laid bare, called into question, revealed to you. And my study of local baseball, I think one of the things I learned and was glad to share with people is its importance as a window into our entire society. It's only one window. There are many windows. But that one window I found to be completely fascinating. It touched upon matters of the myths and legends we tell ourselves, what Americans think is or is not important, issues of class and race. There were scandals galore, there were moments of glory, there were moments of defeat. It was just great storytelling. It was like a giant soap opera, but a soap opera that really told us a lot.
Thank you so much, and I hope at some point in the future we have a chance to sit down and talk a little further about this whole topic. Thanks,
Anytime.
Brian. Good morning, Paul.
Good morning.
Let's start with, for the record, stating who you are and what you do.
My name is Paul Gaffney. I'm a professor of humanities at Landmark College in Putney, Vermont. I live here in Florence, Massachusetts. That's who I am.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned that you live here in Florence, Massachusetts, but you do more than that. As I understand, you're quite an authority on Florence history. You study where you're living.
Yes, yes.
Tell me about some of the history of Florence.
Florence is kind of a unique spot in Northampton's history, which this is a larger part of. It was founded separately. It has 19th century origins as opposed to the 17th century origins of the city of Northampton, then the town of Northampton. And it comes out of a very different period in history and much different things going on. So it's the industrialization, reform movements, abolition of slavery, women's rights, issues that are far different than what was going on in Puritan Northampton in 1654.
Tell me about some of the highlights of that history. I know it's not possible to do this comprehensively given the time allowed, but tell me, for instance, about the Utopian movement here.
Okay, the Utopian society that was formed here, the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, officially started in 1842. They took over about 500 acres of land in what's now Florence, was then called Broughton's Meadow. And it included a 4-story silk factory, which had been built in the silk craze boom of the 1830s by Samuel Whitmarsh, who lived downtown and was a merchant turned industrialist. But that was a failing with the Depression of 1837. Whitmarsh's business basically went under and was in receivership, and one of the men who was called in to manage it and kind of hold on and hope that things would come to life became one of the founders of the Northampton Association of Education Industry, the Utopian group we're talking about. And he was here, and then Samuel Hill, who was an in-law of his, and some other folks, George W. Benson, various people who were active in abolitionist circles, but also had industrial experience in Rhode Island and Connecticut mainly. Came in 1841, and we're talking about forming a community. The 1840s is noted as a period of a lot of utopian groups being formed in the United States. So it was the boom, what Christopher Clark, the historian, calls the communitarian moment. It was the advent of industrial capitalism, and how are people going to deal with wage labor and all those sorts of things. So these folks had issues, saw issues in the United States about slavery and about freedom, but also about how to become an industrial society, how to shape values that made some sense to them. So they got this 500 acres of land and this silk factory and 6 or 7 dwelling houses, and they started to form this community, and officially started it in April of 1842. And had to deal with all the issues that communal groups have to deal with. Who do you let in? What are they write a constitution, and all kinds of issues that have to be dealt with. And
where was Broughton's Meadow?
Broughton's Meadow is actually the meadows that sort of surround Florence, that kind of ring around right by the Mill River, down where the Ross Farm is, from Look Park down till you get to Bay State, basically. And that was very rich soil, of which there's not a whole lot in Massachusetts. It's very similar to the meadows in Northampton, which served a similar farming purpose in the 17th century. And in fact, that area had been used for farming. There were kind of outlying farms in the 1600s and 1700s. So Florence was a scattered outskirts of Northampton. It was there were maybe a dozen families living here in the 1830s, but they were very scattered, and it was just generally called Broughton's Meadow for this long division of lands that were farmed. It was also occasionally called Warner's School District. There was a little one-room schoolhouse up by Look Park for the various scattered families from the lower parts of Leeds and Florence to send their children to. So that was kind of the background of that.
So what became of the community? They worked out their constitution. They got all the right answers to those questions, and what happened next?
Well, they are notable for what they espoused and what they stood for, which was a strong anti-slavery, very strong emphasis. They were Garrisonian abolitionists, so they believed very strongly in women's rights, and saw a larger. They were trying to address much larger issues. And they survived for about 4.5 years into the, officially ending in November of 1846. There was struggles. They had a lot of debt. That was a big problem. They had differences of opinion as to how to run an organization, always an issue in intentional communities, in utopian groups. So, but the debt in many ways could be seen as they were always struggling. They were producing silk, which was successful, but not quite the money maker that they hoped. And the United States was at this point just emerging from this long depression in 1837, so the first few years were fairly tough. But they hung on, and in that same time period, it was pretty typical that 1 out of every 2 businesses would fold within a year or two. So, if you look at it in terms of a business history, that 4.5 years may not seem like much to us, but in fact was, it was something of an accomplishment to try to run an alternative business and live together and shape values. And one of the things that in some ways was a strength but also a weakness was that they had no central creed. You did not have to sign up for any particular religious beliefs. You could believe whatever you wanted to. Now that allowed them to have a lot of flexibility and a lot of individualism, but it also made it more difficult for the center to hold, as it were, because you didn't sign on to a particular, agreeing to a particular philosophy.
Were there any vestiges of this community that remained after its dissolution, after 4.5 years?
Yeah, there's the village of Florence. It really grew out of that. A number of them, about 67 of the numbers went from 100 to 200 at various points, but about 60-something of them stayed on in Florence and formed what they saw as something of an alternative way of doing this thing, what they called neighborhood community, which was no longer to share everything, but to build up a neighborhood. And Samuel Hill, and most notably in a national sense, is Sojourner Truth, the great black abolitionist and feminist, who was a member for 3 years and then stayed on. And a number of families stayed on. They built up businesses. The silk business was hung in there and became quite profitable. They started a number of other businesses, and eventually this new downtown Florence, as such as it is. But Florence became the industrial heart of Northampton, so it was quite booming in the 19th century.
Right through the second half of the 19th century?
Yep. They weathered the Depression of 1873 apparently quite well. There's no 1893 Depression, which was even deeper, was much more troubling, and there were the first signs of labor unrest, which was widespread in the United States, but it seemed to not arise in Florence. They kept a kind of a community feeling, even though people were now being paid the going rate for wages in the factories. And they survived quite well. The Silk Company did very well. The Florence Manufacturing Company also arose out of the aftermath of the Utopian group, and it's now later became Pro-Brush. Started as a daguerreotype case manufacturer and eventually went into toothbrushes, and the prophylactic toothbrush, as we all know, was until Oral-B came along, the dominant toothbrush in the United States. So it boomed well into the 20th century. By the early 20th century, what you see is the outside capital is really taking over the businesses, the industrial heart of Florence, so that Samuel Hill and Alfred Lilly and other sort of founding fathers, as it were, of Florence are no longer, they've died and their generations have come up, but the capital is outside, and so that sense of a tight little community where the owners and the managers and the workers all know each other and everything has pretty much dispersed. That kind of fits because big business is taking over in America, and the large corporations, the age of Carnegie and Rockefeller and whatnot, is maybe held off for a while in Florence, but is, eventually those realities of industrial capitalism certainly hit here.
Did William Lloyd Garrison ever come here?
William Lloyd Garrison came every year. In fact, his brother-in-law was one of the founders. George W. Benson was a brother-in-law of Garrison, and Wendell Phillips came here, and all the great, and that continued really until the 1890s probably, with famous reformers. It was such a strong center for women's rights and healthcare reform and civil rights and such things.
Where would they deliver their speeches?
Well, when it was in the community days, they spoke often under a big, tall pine tree in the back of what's now the Florence Congregational Church. After the Civil War, they built a magnificent sort of Richardsonian building which they called Cosmian Hall, the Temple of Free Speech, and that became the center of Florence. That was where reformers from all over the United States, Louisa May Alcott, Bronson Alcott, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Black, White, Frederick Douglass gave the opening speech, was one of the folks there. So they were, who's who in reform came through Florence. And
Is that pine tree still there?
I don't know. I'm not an arborist, so I doubt it. There are still pine trees here, though.
Maybe a seedling or a sapling.
Yeah.
Sojourner Truth, in a minute or so, can you tell us a little bit more about her time here?
Well, Sojourner came in November of 1843, the same year she had changed her name and set off on a journey in search of truth, and God had spoke to her and told her to come, and she wandered through Long Island and walked up through Connecticut and was on a spiritual journey and ended up with these folks in Florence, settled in and became quite close to them and quite valued as a member, and then stayed on and built her first house, with Samuel Hill provided the mortgage money, which she published her narrative when she was here. She dictated to a local resident and sold that and paid off her mortgage within 3 years. And
where was the house?
The house is on Park Street. It's still there. We just discovered it about a year ago.
Do you know the number?
35. It's Kim and Ann Howe's house. Yeah, the frame of it is still there. I mean, it's been changed a lot, but yeah. So she was very much a part of the community and greatly loved. And she and Hill were quite close, and both were sort of strict moralists and very religious spirits. So they were here. And
then she left?
In 1857, we don't know why exactly she left because there's no written documentation of why, but she first bought the lot next door, creating a much bigger property for her little house, and then in 1857 sold that and moved to Battle Creek, Michigan, where she had a number of friends, white women friends she was very close to, and then she lived the rest of her days in Battle Creek.
And buried there now? Buried there now,
yeah.
Any famous people buried in Florence? Famous, quote unquote?
No, probably not. Not in the who's who of big names. A lot of there's several sort of ordinary folks that played a big part. Samuel Hill, Basil Dorsey, an escaped slave who had some fame in his day, as he and his brothers ran away, and he eventually ended up here in Florence and built a family and settled here. All of the manufacturing people and laborers and several free black families that lived here are buried here. So, but nobody, no big names.
In the last few seconds that we have, is there a book that you might recommend for people who would like to pursue this further and learn more about the history of Florence?
Sure. The best thing to do is to, for the Northampton Association of Education Industry, by far the best source is Christopher Clark's book, The Communitarian Moment, The Radical Challenge of the Northampton Association. And another source well worth reading is Charles Sheffeld's. He was the grandson of Samuel Hill, and in 1895 he published A History of Florence. And it's very much an 1890s type history, but there's a lot of rich stuff in there, and it's actually quite well done. It's not scholarship of what that we would look at, but it's really well worth exploring.
Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure to sit here this morning. I
All
wish
right.
we had more time.
Yeah.
Perhaps we can do. Hello, Martha.
Hello.
Let's begin with you stating your name for the record and a little bit about what you do.
Okay. My name is Martha Hoppen, and I am an art historian specializing in American art, particularly the 19th century. And I freelance as a curator doing exhibitions and research for museums in the area.
Great. All right, we have a lot of ground to cover in just a few minutes. Tell me a little bit about some of that 19th century history of landscape art here in the valley, in the greater Northampton area.
Okay. Landscape painting as a type of painting really wasn't popular anywhere in this country until really the middle of the 19th century, starting in the 1830s with the rise of what's known as the Hudson River School under artists like Thomas Cole in particular. He's the one who's seen as the founder. And once that happened, Northampton's prominence kind of coincided with that movement. And the reason is really like the old real estate joke, location, location, location. Northampton at the foot of Mount Holyoke. When you look out from the top of Mount Holyoke and you're looking at the whole valley, you see straight ahead Northampton spread out in front of you. And of course to the left of your view would be the Oxbow, and to the right would be the town of Hadley. But it's the whole view that enchanted everyone in the early 19th, from the early 19th century on. Guidebooks sang its praises, and artists were drawn to paint it, and so Northampton and the mountain became part of a grand tour of American, you could say, American major sites for tourists and writers and artists. And so this coincided with the importance, the growing importance of landscape painting. And so it was really mostly landscape painters who would come to the region or who would be local artists painting the local landscape. And I was going to say that portraiture had been the dominant subject up until that time. And in that case, if you were a portraitist, you, in order to get enough clients, you mostly lived in major cities or hit the road, were itinerants like Erastus Salisbury Field, who was working over in the Amherst region. So it wasn't until landscape became such an important subject that Northampton's rise as an art site, you might say, occurred. And then landscape really dominated until, pretty much the end of the 19th century, when other subjects began to assume importance. Figure painting with, there was a big mural movement. And the second subject, as a PS here, was genre painting, scenes of everyday life. And that was second, really, to landscape in the 19th century. But there was no big genre school or genre painting happening in this area. It was really landscape, dictated by the natural site, you could say.
Who would buy a painting of the Oxbow?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, I am sure that local people bought some of them, but it was a national subject bought by an audience throughout the country, or you could say probably primarily on the East Coast. And it was produced, pictures of the Oxbow, say, or looking towards the direction of Hadley from the mountain. That was also a very popular view, and of course that would take in a lot of Northampton, as is the view from the Oxbow often takes in the Northampton meadowlands that are in part of that picture. The artists who were painting those pictures lived in a variety of places and came to the area as part of the tourists, in a sense. But they also, some of them never came here. And it's a very interesting chapter in that one of the most prominent artists to paint the view was French and never set foot over here. But he and many of these others painted the scene based on prints that they found in books. one book in particular called American Scenery, and they were copying a specific image by an Englishman named Bartlett, who visited here in 1836, did this print, and from then on, I mean, that really put the site on the map. In fact, when he came to do the whole eastern seaboard, and he chose, for this region, he chose 4 views to issue as prints. The view from Mount Holyoke towards the Oxbow, the one towards Hadley, a view from the river looking up at Mount Tom, and then a view of downtown Northampton, of the streets of downtown Northampton as seen from the porch of a hotel.
Where is that collection today?
Well, the original drawings are scattered. That's what he did. And then these were engraved and issued later in print form as part of a book. And these you can find locally. You can buy them right downtown. They're wonderful. They're not very expensive. And for what they are, in fact, probably the most important record from the 19th century. And they go almost unnoticed, I think, in gallery. You can buy them right downtown.
And for Thomas Cole's paintings, for instance,
Yes,
other
now-
great landscape artists,
Yes.
they're collected where? In New York?
Now, yes, and then there'd be that level of work that I'm just speaking of, where it could be any artist, and many of them were untrained, and there runs the gamut from highly trained down to not trained. And then there is the Hudson River School and the really prominent landscape figures who did also come through this region. Not all of them, but chief among them would be, of course, Thomas Cole. And it's Cole's view of the Oxbow, which hangs in the Metropolitan Museum, which is the single most important painting of this region from either the 19th or the 20th century. I don't think it will ever lose that first place. Others have done marvelous paintings of the region, but pride of place goes to the Cole painting. But it, interestingly, went into a private collection and was hardly seen in the 19th century, except when it was shown on 3 occasions in New York. So Cole's colleagues, artist colleagues, would have been aware of it. But I don't think the general public would have known it at all. The general public knew the Bartlett print. So there's a sort of split there in who knew what.
So visitors to the Metropolitan Museum from around the world
Yeah.
have some acquaintance with
Oh, yes, now.
our landscape
Yes.
in Northampton.
Yes. And now, since the Metropolitan acquired it in the early 20th century, 1908, I think, and from then on, one can see that it's assumed more and more importance until it's called, at times, you can read American history books, the most important American landscape painting of all time,
How about local artists indigenous to this area? Any come to mind during this period?
Not in that early period so much. There was a kind of blossoming of art in this particular, in Northampton and in some of the surrounding areas like Springfield. The golden age, you might call it, was really pretty much the post-Civil War years, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And there were some local artists of note. I think really it was Smith College and its art department that probably provided the most catalyst, you might say. One of the artists named Champney, Benjamin Champney, highly trained in Europe, as were a number of them. They may have been local, but they had gone abroad for training, or at least to New York. This was a very typical pattern. Champney taught at Smith, I think, starting in 1877. And then after Champney, in the mid-1880s, came Dwight Tryon. And then he was there for until the 1920s at Smith. And he was a nationally known painter. So, I mean, there were local artists, partly because of Smith, but there was also a local art scene. Some of the, one of the interesting ones was Charles Burley, who is not a major talent, but a very interesting artist, who a lot of his work is at the Northampton Historical Society. He unfortunately died young, so there isn't a lot of work. The ones who are most interesting to me personally, and about whom there's really almost no record, would be the Lathrop Sisters, Clara, Suzanne, and Bessie, I think, starting in the 80s probably, even the 1870s, were active as artists, all three of them, in Northampton. They had a studio on Main Street. It was referred to as the Northampton Salon. Bessie was a furniture designer. Suzanne, I think, was a painter, and I think Clara was also a painter.
Part of the early arts and crafts movement?
That, there's so little left from them. This to me is the most interesting area for somebody to explore, is how to find work by and more out about the Lathrop sisters, who were a major part of the art scene in the late 19th century and seem to have been kind of, I assume it's because their work has been dispersed and just not recognized today.
And that brings us to today.
Yes.
Are we in a golden age in Northampton?
We are indeed. The big mystery to me is what happened in the 30s and 40s during the Depression years. But there's no mystery that today we are in a big resurgence, which started, I think, in the 60s and really has gathered steam in the 80s and 90s. And there again, it's partly to do with major artists coming to live in this region, partly in connection with Smith College. And that would be Leonard Baskin, who came in the 1950s and, of course, stayed through into the early 70s. And then the next, I would say, major figure or figures to have an influence like Baskin would be the Gillespies, Fran Gillespie and Gregory Gillespie. And out of that, their, you could say, influence, and Alfred Leslie, who moved to Amherst in the 70s, there has arisen a very recognizable school of realist painters, often dubbed, the Valley Realists. And there are some major figures today, like Scott Pryor, who is known nationally, who lives right in Northampton. So it's really a flourishing area. And for some of these artists, they're not painting the landscape, but a great many of them are. And the most interesting thing is that they've gone back to these subjects that were so popular in the 19th century. They've gone back to the view from Mount Holyoke, the view of Mount Holyoke, the view of the Northampton Meadows. These subjects that were what the people wanted in the 19th century are what the people want today, and for some of the very same reasons. The great beauty of the land and the, in a sense, interest in preservation that spurs this wanting to keep the landscape the way it is now, the way it was then. So
you've done it. You've covered a great deal of ground.
Well,
here.
I left somebody out who was very important. And when you were asking about who came here, I should have mentioned Thomas Ferrer, who came in 1865. He was a very important New York artist who came and lived in Northampton for the summer of 1865 and painted some of the most beautiful views of the region. One of his pictures, which is at the Smith College Museum, shows Northampton laid out from the view of the dome of the hospital up on the hill. So you see all of the town laid out and the meadows beyond. It's probably the transcendent image of Northampton, the bustling, peaceful, harmonious, gorgeous town.
A precursor, perhaps, to what would still exist a century or more later.
Yes. So I was just, he unfortunately only spent that summer, but he gave some of the most beautiful work.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to sit and chat.
Thank you.